So thank you all for coming back this morning. It's either hardest to be the people who stand between you and a reception or the people who are ripping you away from your morning coffee. So I appreciate everyone rejoining us this morning, and I want to begin by thanking Mount Sinai and the World Childhood Foundation for pulling us together to have a conversation about what is the way forward. I think all of us who have worked in the area of child protection and human trafficking believe that an emphasis on prevention, an emphasis on understanding the systematic drivers of poverty, inequity, and power that lead us to a conversation today are really critical. And I think this morning's panel will help us address some of these questions. I've asked each of the panelists to begin, and I've asked them to think hard about what are the policies, what are the structural issues that drive us, and what is the way forward. So each of the panelists will bring us an amazing perspective. And we're going to start, and we're going to walk our way this way. And so our first panelist who will speak represents the U.S. government at USAID. And it's very interesting. When I was speaking with Veronica, I said, I've worked in global health and development for 30 years, and I didn't even understand that USAID works on human trafficking, that they have someone with her expertise and her commitment to working to help on the global level. Because in the old days, in public health, we used to have international health and domestic health. And I think there is now a real understanding that there is no such thing, that it is we live in a globalized world. The abuse and trafficking of children is a global issue, and that there are lessons to be learned on the global level, and there are lessons to be learned on the domestic level, and that the world would be a better place if we had a better interchange. So I'm going to ask her to begin by helping us to understand the policy environment.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lyndon. And good morning. I'm going to start also by thanking Mount Sinai and the World Childhood Foundation for the chance to be a part of this. I'm excited actually to learn from my fellow panelists and also all of you in the audience as you share your insights and ask questions. I'm sure there are many rich and diverse perspectives in the room on how to advance the fight against child sex trafficking. Regarding the particular perspective that I bring to the discussion, I work on this issue, as Lyndon mentioned, internationally. My agency, USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, provides U.S. foreign assistance to developing countries, and as a result, we view human trafficking through an international development lens. And I'll talk more about that perspective as we engage in our discussion this morning. But I wanted to mention that those of us who work on the issue internationally don't have many opportunities to dialogue with our U.S. counterparts combating trafficking in persons domestically. So again, thank you to the organizers for this unique opportunity to engage with my co-panelists working on to combat trafficking in the U.S. Primarily. And because there is so much robust work being done in the U.S. to address this issue here, I'm going to keep an ear out as we discuss today for best practices that are used domestically that may be transferable to the international contexts. And in addition, there may be unexplored ways for domestic and international counter-trafficking stakeholders to partner to address the flow of victims from the countries where we work at USAID to the United States. And I think that addressing trafficking simultaneously in those source countries and the U.S. could lead to some very powerful outcomes. Excuse me. So those are just some of the thoughts floating around in my head as we dialogue today, and I'd be happy to share in the context of our discussion more about some of the policy shifts that we have undertaken in the U.S. government to respond to this issue over the years as we've learned more about it, and also discuss some of our efforts to address it. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So our next speaker, whose name is Kate Mullen, she brings a unique perspective. She was instrumental working with her colleague and friend, Rachel Lloyd, with a groundbreaking law here in New York State. She brings the legal perspective, and as you know, when we're looking at these issues, when we take a comprehensive look at what are some of the most important tools we have for the protection of children, we often turn to the legal community and ask them for leadership and ask them to help us draft policies and laws that put the protection of children front and center. So Kate, please.
Thank you. Is that better? Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here today to this conference. It's a wonderful opportunity to be able to meet other people who have different experiences but are focusing on the same issue, and hopefully we'll be able to learn and move forward from this. My expertise is in the law. I'm an attorney with the Legal Aid Society and the juvenile rights practice. I've been doing that for many, many years, and I've been working with sexually exploited youth, both in direct representation and in legislative reform. Our practice in the juvenile rights practice not only represents young people who are arrested and charged with crimes in family court, but also young people who are the subject of child abuse cases and PINS proceedings. And that's important because we are continually struggling with how to best serve our clients and how to best move the law forward when it comes to young people who have been commercially sexually exploited. This year is the 10th anniversary of the Safe Harbor Act, of the passage of the Safe Harbor Act, and it was the first law in the United States that recognized that children are the victims of trafficking and not the perpetrators of crimes. As was mentioned by Lyndon, the passage of the Safe Harbor Act would not have been possible without GEMS, without the brave young women of GEMS who really educated the public and educated the legislature about the nature of domestic trafficking. And I think it is so significant that we have international trafficking, domestic trafficking, survivor leadership, all present at the table, because there was a time that trafficking was considered only an international problem. And when we were advocating for the passage of the Safe Harbor Act, we really had to educate that this is a problem that's here in the United States, that's here in New York City, that's here in Brooklyn and the Bronx. And I think the conversation now is not in terms of educating that there are young people who are trafficked in the United States, but what those young people look like and where did they come from. So one of the more disturbing statistics was a recent article that noted that in Connecticut, when there was a recent law enforcement activity that removed 88 young people who were being trafficked, 86 of them had contact with the child welfare system. 86 out of 88. So we can have laws and we can write laws that protect children, but where are we finding these young people and how are we not doing it? Because we're not going to be able to arrest our way out of the problem and we're not going to be able to legislate our way out of the problem. So at the moment, there are several laws in play. There's the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 that's been reauthorized 2003, 2005, 2008, 2013, but it's expired this year and has yet to be reorganized. There is the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act, which is federal legislation, which is geared towards recognizing that there are large numbers of people involved in child welfare systems, and they deserve to be served by being found and identified. The problem with that law is that the way that it was written, it requires all child welfare systems to immediately make a law enforcement referral if they suspect that a young person is a victim of trafficking. And I'm sure that there are many service providers here and people who work with young people who know that that can be the exact opposite way of gaining the trust that you need to begin to have a relationship with someone. When you first suspect that they might be a victim of trafficking, you then provide their name and information to the police. So laws have consequences. The Safe Harbor Act has done, and now is in almost 40 states across the country, some version of a Safe Harbor Act, has done a wonderful job in protecting young people from the trauma of being prosecuted for an act of prostitution in court. But it's also made it a little bit harder to identify young people who are being trafficked because they're not being arrested for prostitution and they're not being brought into court. So people who are in contact with vulnerable young people have to be able to do a better job of identifying who they are. There are now vacatur laws which allow someone who has been a victim of trafficking who has a prosecution for prostitution finding on their record to go into court to vacate that. But that can be a very difficult and ugly process to have to go through. And it's sort of coming a little bit at the end when we really want to start at the beginning. So laws have consequences. I guess that's the information that I'd like to relay, and the advice I'd like to get from the fellow panelists. How can we better make the laws that already are there to protect young people actually do that and make sure that we're not pushing it further along the lines of making it difficult for them to access services?
Thank you, Kate. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Rachel Lloyd. Rachel founded GEMS, and when we spoke in preparation for the panel, she said, I don't want to be seen as someone who's anti-something. I'm for, and what GEMS is doing is we are looking at the future. What is survivor leadership, and how do we help young people, young women predominantly, find their voice and help shape policies that matter about prevention. And so there are many things that I could say about Rachel, her passionate leadership. I would urge everyone to both read her book and watch her TED Talk, because if you want a primer on what is possible, I think Rachel offers us that. But Rachel, I want to ask you, I think Kate's point is really important. Laws have consequences. You were instrumental in passing the law and have watched now 40 states adopt it. What else do we need to be doing? What are the big picture issues that help drive this problem, and what are the big ideas you have about prevention?
How long do we have? I want to thank, first I want to thank Mount Sinai and particularly Angela Diaz. We've had a partnership with Mount Sinai for over 15 years. Our young people get all their medical care and support from Mount Sinai, and it has been a fantastic partnership, and it has meant that young people who otherwise hadn't had medical care in a very long time and saw medical providers as like another authority figure began to see their providers as somebody that they could go to, that they could talk to, that they could go for preventive care. It wasn't just like ER care. And so I just want to thank you for that and that commitment to our young women, a long time before this issue was popular. So thank you. And I want to thank the World Childhood Foundation, who gave us an award a couple of years ago. Thanks. I got to go to Sweden. It's really cool. The unintended consequences thing, as Kate was talking, I was thinking about just even recently, we've seen, the arrests are dropping across the city for all kinds of misdemeanor crimes, but we've seen arrests drop, and that was a primary source of young people through the Alternative to Incarceration program and what's now called the Human Trafficking Intervention Courts. We founded that with Judge Camacho in 2004. And so watching that dramatically decrease in the last year, and then I went on Backpage after we'd seen the numbers for the year, and I went on Backpage, and then seeing so many young women on there and knowing, okay, the arrests are down not because there's less girls. The arrests are down because of a variety of factors, and they're down across the board for numerous other offenses. But, so we have to get, I feel like we're often like the FAA, where we don't figure out what needs to be done until it's already too late, right? Like they didn't start banning, like making you take your shoes off when you got on an airplane until somebody had already brought a bomb in a shoe. They didn't start making you check liquids until somebody had already brought. And so trafficking is a criminal enterprise. And often as service providers, as folks working on legislation, as folks working on policy, we're continuously like 2-3 years behind figuring out, oh wait, it's moved off the street now. Street outreach doesn't work. Oh wait, it's online now, right? And so what this, the bill to hold third-party providers' internet sites accountable, SESTA, passed a couple of days ago. Great. But we're talking about marketplace. That's just the marketplace where it's sold, right? That cracks down on the marketplace. It doesn't crack down on the demand, and it certainly doesn't crack down on the supply. And I think when we hear people talk a lot about demand, and if there was no demand, there would be no trafficking. In an ideal world, yes. And there would still be 86 girls who had run away from foster care, who were homeless and struggling and broke, and there would still be young women figuring out how to provide milk for their babies, and there would still be all these girls who had experienced, and boys and trans youth who had experienced sexual abuse in the home, who felt violated already and felt vulnerable, who were already vulnerable. If there wasn't any trafficking, then what would happen to them? Then they all start selling drugs, then they all start robbing people on the subway as a way to survive. So in order to really address this issue, we really have to start at that really early age, and really, I think it's challenging too to begin to talk about trafficking in a vacuum as opposed to part of a continuum. And I'm glad that this is a conference on kind of the larger issue of violence against children, because it really is part of a continuum of kids growing up in homes with domestic violence, kids growing up in homes where they're sexually abused and physically abused. And unless we start addressing that early part and doing it well, it begins to feel almost inevitable that a young person will meet someone who says, I love you, I'll take care of you, you know, I'm better than whatever you're dealing with at home. And I think that like 0 to 10 piece, I think is the piece that we need to really address. And I think, you know, trafficking has become in the last couple of years this like sexy, sensationalized issue often. And so people are far more interested in talking about, like, let's hear another story about a girl who was kidnapped and then what happened to her. And right, people want those stories as opposed to like, all right, let's get in the weeds about child welfare policy. It's not as exciting. But if we're really going to create real reform, then we need to look at, right, I mean, 90% of the girls we serve are girls of color. 100% of the girls that we serve are low income. If you, having worked across the country and gone into group homes and detention centers and all over the place, poverty is the baseline for almost every child that ends up being vulnerable to the commercial sex industry. Obviously, race and poverty are inextricably linked in many large cities. And so addressing that, people don't want to have conversations about racism when it comes to trafficking. They want to separate out trafficking into a silo and not talk about racial inequity, talk about gender inequity, talk about poverty, talk about communities that have been essentially abandoned. And all of those things that impact kids, lead paint, no green spaces, lack of after-school programs, you know, all of those things that impact kids at an early age end up contributing to this issue that we call trafficking that is like somewhere off in a silo. So I think in order for us to really begin to address this, the trafficking movement, of which I guess I'm part, but I often say that I got a divorce from the trafficking movement many years ago. I'm in the girls and young women's empowerment movement, and I work really specifically with girls and young women who have experienced commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking. Because sometimes I'm embarrassed by the trafficking movement, quite frankly. And so I think we have to not try and get everybody else's issue to join in with us, but we have to commit to racial justice. We have to commit to economic justice. We have to recognize these as our issues too, and not think we can be off in a little silo somewhere, either legislating our way out of the issue and arresting bad men and rescuing little girls, because that was the law enforcement thing, right? They rescued 88 girls. So those are, I could like, this gets me kind of riled up. I think we have gotten off track in the movement in terms of where I think some of us back in the day originally saw this, and I think we still have time to course correct, and if we don't do it now with this administration and all the things that we see happening to young people and all the threats against their well-being and safety, I don't know that we'll ever do it.
Thank you. Our last speaker this morning is a new addition to the panel, so I want to give a shout out to Tom Andriola, who's joining us this morning, both as a survivor and as a bit of a policy wonk, if you will. He works for the New York State Department of Criminal Justice and the Office of Youth Justice. But he also brings an interesting perspective. I think one of the things we often think about is our vision of what is trafficking, and we think of young girls. And yet boys and men are also trafficked and have a special degree of stigma associated with that, and it's one of the things that Tom and I spoke about this morning. So one of the things I'd like Tom to address, which I think is critical, which is what is the role of survivor leadership and what are the special needs of boys and men in this really important dialogue?
Thanks very much. And I appreciate the addition to the panel this morning. It stemmed from my comment yesterday afternoon up at the microphone there, so just keep that in mind as you're coming up for your Q&A.
That would be the unintended consequence of opening your mouth.
But, you know, I spoke yesterday very briefly about the fact that I am a survivor, and I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. I was not an individual who was trafficked, but I was abused in my own home. And, you know, and as many of you know, child sexual abuse is perpetrated primarily by somebody that you know, love, or trust. It's about 90%. And so that creates a special kind of fear that that gets integrated into how you're feeling about it, and I think that's true across the board for survivors. That there's a fear that is sort of integrated into your mind as you are coping with it, as you're trying to get to a point where you feel comfortable disclosing, which took me 14 years to tell a single person, then bottled it right back up. 18 years to seek therapy. And a lot of the stigmas associated with that, you know, especially on the end of young boys and men. You know, we're supposed to be strong. We're supposed to be able to stand up for it. We're supposed to enjoy sex, and the fact that, you know, there are young boys that are being abused by teachers, and, you know, oh, you know, that boy must be lucky, right? Those are all the stigma. Those are all the messages that are going out. And when I look back and when I was finally able to start speaking about my own story, you know, I thought, geez, I should have been able to protect myself. I was strong. And I looked back, and what's the average height and weight of an 11-year-old boy? You know, 4'7", 80 pounds. And then, of course, I look at my own kids who are, you know, who are actually on the smaller side, but who are small themselves. You know, young and innocent kids. And, you know, it's taking them years and years and years to disclose. So how do we bring that into this movement? And I think what some of the other speakers have spoken about is, you know, we do have to come out of our silos. We do have to protect our children in those early ages, 0 to 10. We have to look for the signs. what are the signs? I was adopted. My two older brothers were adopted after I was at an older age. And so what happened in the foster homes that they were in that led to my older brother abusing me at the age of 11? And how do we bring this into survivor leadership? I think we have to meet victims and survivors where they're at. And like I said, it took me many, many years. If you asked me to help lead the movement when I was, 24, 25 years old and I first disclosed, I would have ran. And then, years later in my dark days when I was going through my therapy, I would have shied away from that. But eventually, I came to a point where I'm able to sit up here in front of a full audience of people and speak about it and try to be a leader in that way. And so survivors do have a very important role in leading this effort forward. It's survivors who are ready to do it. And we have to really keep that in mind. We can't push or force individuals into that before they are ready. But when they are ready, they can bring a huge voice to the table and they can help to drive the effort forward.
Great, thank you. Veronica, I'm going to come back to you and ask you to talk a little bit about how our global policies have evolved and changed, and what do you see looking forward?
Great, thank you. There are so many ways in which I have seen trafficking policies shift and change over the years, largely in response to our increased knowledge about the scope and nature of the problem and how to better address it. And I'll give just a couple of examples from my experience at USAID, and these examples touch on some of what, Rachel, you spoke about in terms of really focusing on the root causes, and also the importance of survivor voices. The first example really is a policy response to our increased knowledge over the years about the socioeconomic and other root causes of trafficking in persons. So at USAID, in 2001, we really started to plus up our counter-trafficking programming, largely in response to the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act here in the US that mandated that the US government address trafficking in persons overseas. And so in 2001, we started to really track our counter-trafficking programming. We contributed more money to it. We have about 80 overseas missions in the developing world. And every single mission has a counter-trafficking in persons coordinator. And from DC, we develop policies to guide the programming that is taking place out in the field. So initially, the programs that we were supporting really focused on getting victims out of their trafficking situations and providing them with direct services. So we were supporting police training to facilitate raids and rescues, raids of brothels and rescues, and providing assistance to civil society organizations to provide direct assistance to survivors like shelter, food, medical assistance, security, and so on. And we were also supporting programs to raise awareness about trafficking, to educate vulnerable populations about what it is and how not to be victimized. Now, these programs were good investments, but they really were not connected to our agency's broader mission. And as I mentioned earlier, USAID is responsible for leading the US government's assistance to developing countries. So what that means is, although we do support programs to combat trafficking in persons, that's not our sole purpose. Our broader purpose is to provide money to improve the well-being and quality of life of people in the developing world. And so what this means is that we support a range of programs across many different sectors. We support programs to alleviate poverty, to increase access to quality health care and education, human rights programs, good governance, gender equality, and so on. And so as we recognize that our counter-trafficking programs were not really integrated into this broader mission. And as we gained a better understanding of the root causes of trafficking, we started to make a shift. And we started to, we realized we had to integrate what we were doing to address human trafficking into our global health programs, into our poverty alleviation, economic growth, food security, education programs, in order to address the root causes, rather than just being responsive to these immediate situations of, getting people out of trafficking in persons. And there were a number of ways in which we learned about the root causes of trafficking over the years, but one particularly important source of information for us was survivor voices. And I'll just give you, and these are survivors who shared their stories with us. And I'll give you a brief example from my own experience. A few years ago, I was working closely with a US government-supported NGO that was facilitating raids and rescues of children from brothels, from prostitution. And after they rescued the children, they interviewed them to better understand how they were trafficked in the first place. And one of the girls that they rescued, I'll call her Amma, has a story that has always stayed with me because it really illustrates some of these really critical root factors. Amma ended up in the brothel because when she was 11, her father got sick. And so this was a girl living in a rural village in West Africa. When she was 11, her father got sick and died. Her mother did not have the skills or the education to provide for Amma or her siblings. So at the age of 11, she left her village and she went to the city to find a job. She found a job in a market as a water porter, carrying water. And she was making the equivalent of $1 a day. She did this for a year until a man came up to her on the street and said, if you come and work in my restaurant, you'll make a lot more money. And so she accepted his offer, and he forced her into prostitution in his brothel. The factors that facilitated Amma's entry into trafficking were multidimensional: a healthcare crisis, lack of educational and income opportunities, the absence of social welfare safety nets, the absence of child protection or public safety mechanisms. And I'll just mention that this particular NGO, I thought rather ingeniously, installed a hidden camera in one of the rooms in the brothels, and they captured irrefutable footage of young girls in prostitution, and they showed that footage to law enforcement and the US government so that they could really catalyze a coordinated response to get those girls out of the brothel. So when we developed in 2012 our new agency-wide counter-trafficking in persons policy, we kind of baked an integrated approach into that policy. The first strategic programming objective that we commit to in the policy is to increase integration of our counter-trafficking activities into programs across sectors in our development work. And I can give you a couple of quick examples. Example of an integrated program is a girls' education program in Benin. We supported, focused on increasing primary school enrollment that integrated into the primary school curriculum modules on the dangers of trafficking and how to prevent girls from being victimized. Another education program in Nepal provided basic needs to 3,800 girls in one of the earthquake-affected areas. We provided stationery, tuition, material assistance, as well as academic coaching for students. And the program includes a component that educates the girls about trafficking, teaching them how to protect themselves and about their legal rights. In Mali, we have a justice sector program that focuses on increasing citizen access to justice, and we integrated into it a number of counter-trafficking components. One of them is to train customs and immigration officials, judges, and magistrates about trafficking, to identify vulnerable populations and victims, and to better investigate and prosecute trafficking. And for integration to be effective, our officers out in the field with expertise in global health governance and other areas of development really need to know how to look for opportunities to do this integration. They have to be able to, in the context of their own sector programs, sort of seize on openings to integrate trafficking. And that's why we actually we do agency-wide trainings on human trafficking for these officers in other sectors. And in Nepal, for example, we supported a program that focused on empowering communities to drive and direct their own development programs. We helped citizens create and contribute to community development funds. So in the course of determining what to spend this money on, one of these communities identified trafficking of girls as an issue that needed to be addressed with the development fund. And when our USAID officers managing this program recognized that the community had identified this as a problem, they decided to actually plus up this community development fund with more money to sort of reinforce and strengthen this counter-trafficking effort, and they actually linked to this local community with an international NGO with lots of expertise on combating trafficking, so that the community's counter-trafficking efforts could be informed by sort of identified best practices. Another example, in Mozambique, we supported a media strengthening program where we trained journalists to report more effectively on a range of social and cultural and political issues, and we included a whole session on how to report more effectively on human trafficking. You know that the media very often confuses trafficking, conflates it with other crimes, and so on. And so this was another program that we supported. But I think the broader message here is that even if the work that you do not do, even if the work that you do does not directly address human trafficking. I mean, let's say you're a healthcare organization, a school, a media outfit. You can still join this fight against trafficking by integrating counter-trafficking activities into your work in these ways. There are always opportunities to address this issue in other sectors. And then I just wanted to mention a last thing about this particular example is that even though this work to address the root causes is extremely important, I think there's still a place for those raids and rescues and direct assistance to victims. I know there has been some controversy over some raids that have not been well done in the past, and I think we're still understanding how to do smart raids and how to make sure that we don't harm victims in the course of trying to rescue them and protect them, which often does happen. And I just mention that because, sitting in my office watching the video from this NGO of 11 and 12-year-old girls in prostitution, it's a moment where you just say, we have to do something quickly to get these girls out of this situation. And there's another time and place to sit back and say, how do we prevent this through addressing the facilitating factors and sort of the broader socioeconomic issues?
Great. So I want to thank you for that comment, and I know I could see Rachel nodding her head about a lot of the things you just said. I'm going to ask Rachel to make a brief response and then remind the group that this is going to be your opportunity to come to the microphone. So Rachel, I'm going to ask you to make brief remarks in response, and then ask people who want to ask a question, please line up now.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that when I went rescue, GEMS is, we're not a prevention organization. We're an intervention organization that works with girls. By the time people come to GEMS, they have already experienced commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking. And there are still times where we do the 3 o'clock in the morning, go out, grab somebody up, stick them in the car. The rescue, however, is not a plan for someone's life, right? Like rescue is a moment in time in the middle of the night, and you feed somebody and you give them a shower. And unfortunately, a lot of services have that mentality of like that rescue mentality, which is not about whether they go in and get somebody out of a dangerous situation or not. There's no long-term empowerment plan for that person. There's no opportunity for that young woman to feel like she has agency and choice. And when we're working with folks whose all their choices have been taken away and removed, both in the home growing up with abuse and then by the exploiters, and then by law enforcement and then by systems, and being able to empower young women and boys and trans youth to have choices, and then giving them options for their future. Right, the education piece that you're talking about, at GEMS, we have our education initiative, which we have invested money in to make sure that young women, we have over 100 young women involved in some form of education. I think this year we've got 40 plus girls in college. We've seen bachelor's graduations. I've got one girl pre-med, one girl medical school. So I'll be sending her to you one of these days. And these are young people who a few years ago, girls in our program did not think they wanted to go to college, let alone, they didn't want to get their GED, they didn't want to go to school, it was too many years, they'd been out, they weren't interested, there was no normalizing of education for the girls in our community. And so now girls share like tips on like papers and complain about homework and this professor, and right, it's like this normalization of higher education and moving forward, and that's about breaking economic barriers. So it's not that, I wanted to clarify, it's not that I don't believe in intervention, but I believe that rescue model that's very top down, I as the service provider know best for your life and you should, like that model, I think is, like, we can't just be rescuing girls and sticking them in a house in the middle of nowhere and giving them yoga and like jewelry making classes and then hope that when we return them like to their communities in 6 months that things will miraculously like work out for them, because weirdly it doesn't, and weirdly they go back to their exploiters, right? Because that's what they know. So I just wanted to clarify, I think you knew, but just in case that anybody thought that I wasn't like for intervention.
No, no one. I don't think anyone thinks that. I think this dialogue, though, begins to highlight the fact that it's a complex problem and that it is integrated solutions from media to the judiciary system to education and poverty alleviation that will begin to bring us to a place where we can even have a conversation where we can embrace that prevention is possible. So I'm going to turn to the microphone. Your question, please.
Hi. I'm Dr. Jane Aronson. I'm a pediatrician, and I work in the global arena. Hi, Joanna. I have a question about how you feel the current year that we've just been experiencing, how you join or not join with the outpouring of adult sexual abuse and harassment. How does it affect your personal and your advocacy position, or does it affect you?
Great. I'm going to ask, in a contrast to previous, I'm going to ask for the 2 questions, and then we'll get some responses, and then 2 questions and get responses. So if the next question, and then we will ask the panel, because you asked a very heavy question, and I'm going to let them confer. So your next question, please.
My name is Miriam Kosikanki, and I'm actually a former patient of the Adolescent Health Center in the 70s. Wonderful clinic. So my question is, I wonder if any of the panel participants can talk a little bit about immigration laws and how immigration laws have protect or also us as advocates, how we can support those individuals that come across who are victims of sex trafficking and are engaged in mental health services.
Great, thank you. I'm looking down the table. Veronica, Kate,
So I think that there are immigration laws that protect young people who have been victims of trafficking, and that there are different organizations that help connect to the right kind of visas and getting the right kind of status. And in this particular climate, I think it is very scary to be someone who is out of legal status. So I would urge people to reach out to the organizations if you have a young person who is out of status to see what can be done, because there are numerous different avenues that can be explored. Also in family court proceedings, just a little side note, if you have a young person who has had an adjudication of delinquency in family court, or who has some kind of a criminal conviction, we can try and work to get those records sealed too. So these are all situations that I think are crucial at the moment in this current atmosphere to be having with every young person you come in contact with, and reaching out to the organizations that can help, because there are sometimes things that can be done, but absolutely that's one of the things that sometimes is overlooked in providing emergency services to a young person, but that is, I think, one of the emergency services that should be provided.
and the question about the current environment and the last year of conversation about harassment and Me Too. How does that impact all of you as advocates and leaders?
I just want to say, I think that people tend to think about immigration and trafficking as kids being brought here to be trafficked, whereas what we see is young people who've grown up here, who were brought here when they were small, and they're undocumented. And it's American girls, but they're undocumented. And so making sure that we're cognizant of those young people. I think the Me Too movement, I think I've had so many conversations about this, and how do we help people make the connection? I think a lot of us as survivors felt like I can't even say a Me Too moment, because there's been so many and it's been so normalized in my life. And so I'd have to make 3 pages of legal page lists of and then this time when this guy did this and this, right? Because when you have experienced, complex trauma, right, as opposed to kind of one traumatic, but you've experienced complex trauma, you begin to normalize and minimize. And so it's been, some of the conversations I've had with girls and young women have been about, even for myself, I'll say with some of my friends being like, oh wow, yeah, I should know, but yeah, that was kind of harassment. I just think, and so helping survivors not minimize the things that they experience. I think right now though, the Time's Up movement is very focused on workplace policy. And I think, well, what happens, to my girls who work at Popeyes, right? Because they need a minimum wage job, and yeah, okay, the manager of Popeyes is gonna go along with the policies. No disrespect to Popeyes. Fries are really good. But right, the minimum wage jobs, how are we going to make sure that women who work in those kind of places are included in this fight? And what kind of policies and what kind of, implementation will we see in that? But then what happens when you leave your job at Popeyes and you walk to the bodega and you get harassed on the street? And then you go home and you're in a home where you're experiencing sexual violence within your home. And then you're on the subway and you experience sexual violence on the side, right? I mean, I think Jimmy Kimmel said something at the Oscars about like, yay, time's up, we're gonna solve it in the workplace, and then women will just be sexually harassed everywhere else. Again, I think it's about looking about like that continuum of not just like these one-off situations with a boss, but for some of us who've grown up with just a continuum and a plethora of these exploitive, painful situations that we then begin to minimize and then get very silent around.
So I think the events of this past year and the Me Too movement provide an unprecedented opportunity for all of us to speak up and do something. So you see the hashtag, if you see something, say something. It's if you see something, do something. And that's what we all need to do. And so I'll pose a question to the audience. You know, I stood up there yesterday afternoon and made the suggestion that the Child Victims Act is on the table right now as we speak, and the New York State budget is going to be closing down within the next few days. So how many of you have made that phone call to the New York State Senate to pressure them? And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to do something. Any child that we fail is because all of us have failed that child. And so we need to take a look at that and think about that.
Thank you. I'm going to take 2 more questions, please.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Robinson, and I'm a community educator, health educator. And it is frightening for me to say this, but in 27 years of working as a massage therapist, I've been assaulted in the room with men trying to pay me for extras. And my question is, what are you going to do about the places that are all around the city, and we have to hold a New York State license as massage therapists and pay the state money, and this is worldwide, I'm sorry, and it's very, very humiliating, embarrassing, and it's also frightening to young therapists who haven't been in this profession as long as I have. And I think I needed to speak up because I've had enough. I've had enough of these people all around the city. And we are licensed and trained professionals. I want to know what we're doing about it.
Thank you. I'm going to go to this microphone, and then I'm going to ask some of the panelists to respond.
I could just speak about a lot of this trafficking is going on right under our noses, and as the general public, what can we do to spot all of this if it's going on right under our noses? What are the red flags that we can identify? And is there any specific place that we can go in terms of the police? Is there any specific bureau, or do we just go to patrol and speak to them about it who aren't as experienced or trained?
Great. I love a practical question. I'm going to get this final question here and then ask each of the panelists to respond. And in their responses, I'm going to ask them to make final summary comments as well. Please.
Hi, my name is Tanya. I'm also a former adolescent patient from the 80s. I actually work here. And I've been a part of a lot of public violence as a public health safety issues in the past with helping. And one thing I know we used to have just slightly to inform the public of all these crimes against children was the milk carton, right? So I'm proposing that, not the milk carton missing children, I'm proposing that we go and campaign per school and we do something that's part of the educational system that includes the parents, that when they come to parent-teacher conference, they also get once a year a meeting about how to protect your children and the signs to look for. I do know about gyms. I'm very impressed with what they try to do. They do a lot, and there need to be more gyms like that. But we're not really hearing what's happening. Can you also let us know what we need to do as far as writing? I wasn't here yesterday, and I do want to be a part of being a voice, and I think many people can be a voice, but in the educational system, it should be a program that teaches against sex trafficking.
Great. I will address that in my final remark, but I'm going to march down the table and ask each of the panelists to give a final comment, responding hopefully to each of these questions, but also giving us one specific action that each of us could take. Oh, we have more time for questions. All right. So we're going to start at that end of the table, but on what educators can and should do. Darkness to Light has a program called Stewards of Children. It is available both online and in person and on an app that you can get from the App Store. It's called Stewards of Children. What Stewards of Children does is it elevates survivor stories and helps you to understand through each of the voices of survivors what are the signs of grooming, what are the ways that you can recognize that adults are behaving inappropriately and perhaps putting children at risk. It helps you to understand what actions you can take, how to respond. One of the most devastating things we have found in our work over the last 15 years is that often children try to disclose and they are not heard. We give concrete examples of that. And so what can you do, or what should you do when a child discloses to you? Also, what can you do as a bystander if you see something, and as Tom says, what can you do and what must you do to respond appropriately when you see something that doesn't look right? And so I would encourage everyone to get trained, and this training was developed for people. You don't need a master's degree, you don't need a bachelor's degree, you need a 6th grade education, and it's available online in English and in Spanish, and it really helps you to recognize the signs and respond appropriately. Veronica.
One thing that I would mention is that many of us are part of larger institutions, whether we're students at a university or if we're working at Mount Sinai or whatever institutions we're connected to. One thing that is always possible and that we have done at USAID is we adopted in 2011 a Counter-Trafficking in Persons Code of Conduct. And it prohibits our employees all over the world, so in 80 countries, from engaging in human trafficking or any behaviors that may facilitate trafficking. And in that list, we include engaging in commercial sex, because we believe that commercial sex facilitates trafficking and creates demand. So we have this code of conduct, and our code of conduct requires our employees. I mean, when they become employed, they sign something saying they will do this. It requires them to report suspected violations of this code committed by other employees to our Office of Inspector General. Also to report any contractors or grantees of the US government when they're out in the field who may be engaging in nefarious activities. We're actually about to expand our code so that it will cover all forms of sexual exploitation and abuse. This is largely because, I don't know if you've heard about the recent abuses in Syria and among the Rohingya in Burma and Bangladesh, during the Haiti earthquake and so on. And we want to make sure that our own employees are not engaging in that behavior, and we have had employees report to our Inspector General and be dismissed, or in some cases be subjected to criminal action for what they've done. So if you can always lobby your institutions, universities can have codes of conduct prohibiting their students and their faculty from engaging, and so on and so forth, and this can be a powerful tool to combat it. And then I also thought the question about the Me Too question was very interesting, and I just wanted to respond briefly. In the sort of international context, I think what it underscores, I mean, there have been a number of reported trafficking victims who've experienced trauma years after having been trafficked. They're they're revisiting their experiences because of the Me Too movement. And I think it just really underscores actually what you were saying, Rachel, about needing to provide support structures for victims in the long term. I mean, I'm aware of one victim who 17 years after she was trafficked is now experiencing significant trauma because of all of these reports about abuse. And we need to think about mechanisms for long-term supports, and one mechanism that a group of survivors recommended to the U.S. government, which I think is very good, is supporting survivor networks. Because if survivors, they rarely want to stay in touch with, certainly us, supporting programs to provide direct assistance. They don't often want to stay in touch with social workers. But other survivors can be a terrific support structure, and if we can help support those networks so that 17 years down the road, if somebody is feeling traumatized, they can tap into their survivor network for support. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kate. And I'm just going to give the panel, we have 4 minutes, and then we're like cutting off all the microphones.
Okay, so in terms of what people can do, in terms of legislative reform, there's a website run by Polaris Project, which updates legislative activities, and I would encourage people to go on it and then, respond, reach out. As was said, there's nothing like a phone call to a legislator to say, I'm concerned about this, please pay attention to this, to make sure that change happens. You can donate to programs like GEMS, and people are always willing to take your money. So that's, the needs are endless for GEMS or other programs that serve trafficking. But really, it's I can't minimize the impact of that. If you're a practitioner in family court, be very aware of young people who have been victimized by commercial sexual exploitation are not always at the same place of recovery. So please stop using terms like AWOL. So if you have a young person who is sent to a program but then leaves for a while, don't call her AWOL. She's not in the Army. She's no obligation to be there. She's there because hopefully she's getting help. Be conscious of how you speak to that young person. Don't penalize them for struggling with their recovery. This happens over and over and over again, that you have someone who's in court under a child protective proceeding, and they are basically shamed for not following the program that's been set up for them. So we have to understand we are serving these young people who are vulnerable. They're not answering to us, and just be very conscious of that.
Thank you, Rachel.
So to go to the Survivor Network piece, if you are a survivor in the room or you work with survivors of any age, GEMS actually has our national program is called the Survivor Leadership Institute and Resource Center. We have an annual conference every year. This year it's next month. We have like 110 survivors coming to Oakland. It's the largest gathering of survivors in the US to date. And we've got survivors, seniors. They'd kill me if I said how old they were. But we have women who have been out for 30 years, but still want to have those connections. And we're also providing professional development, opportunities for economic advancement, so that survivors don't get stuck in that role of being a survivor, but that you have options outside of that. I would say things you can do, donate. Lots of people will come up to me after a conference and say, I want to volunteer at GEMS. And look, there's a volunteer thing on our website, and I encourage you to check that out. Often what we need is back office support or graphic design or that kind of stuff. People generally want to be the person who goes out on the street and rescues girls. Go join Big Brother, Big Sister and be a mentor and get involved in that first 0 to 12 years of a child's life and stick with it for like 5 years, because we know that the research shows that one healthy adult in a young person's life can provide the resilience that they need to be able to make it through all kinds of adversity. And so healthy children in healthy communities won't ever walk through the doors of GEMS. And so, right, it's not as exciting maybe, but it'll be a hell of a lot more effective to be able to intervene at an earlier point and to make that commitment. And if you can't do that with Big Brother, Big Sister, you've got a kid in your family, right? You've got a niece, you've got a god sister, you've got somebody who you could play an important role in their life and who needs an adult who can be healthy, that will listen to them. Right, as kids, I would say that both of us would have really liked to have had a healthy adult in our lives who would have listened to us and who would have been there for us and who would have stood up for us and advocated for us if we shared something tough with them. So you can be that in kids' lives.
It's a 360-degree approach that we need to take. Each and every one of us has a role and a responsibility. So if you're not sure what to do, you can speak to one of us, but we can help you figure out what to do.
Great. I want to ask you all to join me in thanking this extraordinary panel.